Good morning or good afternoon to you today, and welcome to our beginning of our 5th year of our Food Safety Matters webinars. I'm glad that you could join us today, and it looks to be a great year of good topics for food safety. I'm Miriam Eisenberg, Manager of Food Safety and Public Health with the EcoSure Division of Ecolab. Today's speaker is Dr. Ruth Petran. Dr. Petran is Vice President, Food Safety and Public Health at Ecolab Incorporated. She provides technical expertise and consultation to internal and external customers on food safety and public health issues by identifying and tracking emerging food safety trends and new control strategies. To be most impactful, these span the food supply chain from farm to manufacturing processes and to food service and retail. Prior to joining Ecolab, Dr. Petran was a research microbiologist and supplier quality manager at Pillsbury, as well as specifications manager and quality regulations operations product manager at General Mills. Dr. Petran is a member of the National Advisory Committee for the Microbiological Criteria for Foods and the Minnesota Food Safety and Defense Task Force. She's a professional member of the Institute of Food Technologists and is recognized as a certified food scientist. Dr. Petran has a Bachelor of Science degree in Consumer Food Science from Cornell University, a Master of Science degree in Food Science from the University of Minnesota, and a doctorate in Public Health from the University of Minnesota. Her thesis focused on the value of leveraging data from health department inspections to improve food safety. And with that, I'd like to introduce Dr. Ruth Petran. Take it away, Ruth.
Thank you, Miriam, and may I add my welcome to all of you who've joined us on the phone. We appreciate your participation. I look forward to sharing information from you on these topics. First of all, recognition that foodborne illness is really a significant public health concern, and we need to do all that we can to drive rates down. I contend that leveraging available data, such as that available from the CDC, FDA, what consumers tell us, and certainly health departments, may be a way to help us identify mitigating strategies that really will work, perhaps at the restaurant level, but also to guide development efforts, training, and so on. So let's jump into this. This map shows estimates of foodborne illness across the globe. Globally, it's estimated that at least 1 billion people are affected by foodborne illness, and perhaps 2 million or more of them die. In the U.S., it's about 1 in 6 of us each year suffers from foodborne illness. Another set of data from the CDC tells us that more than half of foodborne illness outbreaks in the U.S. are attributed to restaurant or food service served meals. Data from Europe, which is not shown here, but somewhat mirrors this as well, indicating that at least a quarter of illnesses in Europe also follow this pattern. What makes us sick? Well, we know that norovirus is the leading cause of foodborne illness among top reported outbreaks, but we shouldn't forget the other organisms that can affect us as well. Salmonella is the number 2 reported illness, and then Clostridium perfringens and or other toxin-related illnesses are close thirds. And then certainly the cost of foodborne illness is significant. Figures from the National Restaurant Association estimated that per establishment there was a cost of about $75,000 per outbreak. This included fees for legal, for medical claims, lost wages, and sanitizing. Then there's certainly the business risk, which is hard to estimate, but it's north of tens of millions of dollars in lost sales across the chain, primarily due to word of mouth, social media, regulatory actions, etc. And then probably most importantly, there's a public health risk. We talked about how 1 in 6 of us become sick in the U.S., but 3,000 of us die because of foodborne illness. Recent figures from the USDA Agricultural Research Service were published late in 2014 showing this total human cost of foodborne illness. And we see from these data that salmonella is the number 1 cause of foodborne illness in terms of cost. with a $3.7 billion price tag each year. Norovirus is number one in terms of cases, as we previously said, and is still a significant cost driver. Certainly impacts on this include the size of the outbreak, how severe the illness is, what complications and long-term health effects might be seen. But in total, the top 15 pathogens that affect humans in the U.S. are estimated to have health costs of at least $15 billion each year. So clearly, the problem of foodborne illness is significant. 1 in 6 of us suffers, but we need action to drive these rates of illnesses down. And obviously, for these actions to be most impactful, we want to focus these efforts where they're going to have the biggest bang for the buck. So leveraging data to help guide efforts appropriately seems to make sense. So through this presentation, we're going to look at several sets of data and then some examples of how these might be used. Starting off with more data from the CDC. These are published periodically, and these represent foodborne illness outbreaks from 2012. And here we see that the top contributing factors to illness which were identified in this analysis included improper holding, which relates to temperature control, poor personal hygiene, inadequate cooking, and contamination from the equipment or environment that might have been used. Another set of data is available from FDA. For many years, they have done what they call risk factor observational studies. These were done over the period of 1998 to 2008 in 3 phases in food service and food retail establishments. Generally, they did see improvements in practices over time, but the risk factors that were in most need of attention included improper holding time and temperature, poor personal hygiene, and contamination from the equipment and environment, which relates very closely to what CDC saw in their investigation of foodborne illness outbreaks. Now, FDA has committed to repeat these studies, and they actually started them in 2013, and they will go through 2025. And in addition to looking for risk factors, they also hope to assess the impact of various industry and regulatory intervention strategies and their effectiveness on addressing these. So we will have more data out that we can use. But I think it's important that we use these top food safety contributing factors as an opportunity to build easy-to-use and simple solutions to address the risk areas. So translating this down a little bit, we saw that, for example, one of the categories from the CDC data was improper holding. And this relates to things like holding food at room temperature for several hours, inadequate cold temperatures, slow cooling, insufficient time and temperature of hot holding, etc. Poor personal hygiene is obviously things related to hands, infected workers, and so on. And contamination to things like inadequate cleaning and cross-contamination from products or the environment. So I think focus on these top contributing factors, as shown here on the slide, can help drive the rates of foodborne illness down. And these include improper holding temperature, poor personal hygiene, inadequate cooking, unapproved source, and contaminated equipment. Now, it sounds easy when we talk about it, but there's certainly challenges that exist. Certainly from an operational standpoint, what is able to be done, what consumers might ask us to do, and then what the inspectors are asking for as well. So we know certainly operators, and many of you fall into this category, certainly want to be proactive and to prevent foodborne illness. But there's realities of creation of a food safety culture that make this difficult, that need to be considered in working to put these programs in place. The reality of people. We have conflicting priorities. We may not all understand what food safety is or understand the risks. Sometimes it's hard to undo what we've been doing for many, many years. The reality is we need to work quickly, and there's constant introduction of new products, new processes perhaps, and then following through to make sure issues get fixed. There's processes that can impact this as well. Compliance to the food code. Having data that would allow us to focus on what really makes sense We don't have a lot of metrics on this. And then people don't always comply with the standards. There's high turnover. There may be language barriers or cultural differences that could affect the processes. And then certainly costs. There's never enough. We may not have the power or budget to do what we need to do. And then consumers, which are certainly a very, very key consideration. And here's data which were collected a number of years ago on from a survey of about 80,000 people, indicating the top attributes that they look for when they're dining out. Not surprisingly, the taste and quality of the food ranked numbers 1 and 2, but I think it's interesting to also note how high clean dishes in the restaurant environment ranked on this list as well. Certainly bathroom cleanliness as well. So these are the things that consumers are looking for when they're coming to a restaurant. How about inspectors? It's estimated that on an annual basis that there's millions of restaurant health department inspections done each year. I believe that an opportunity exists to mine the data that come out of inspections to help determine the role that these results may play in helping to identify risks. And from this, we can identify those risks that are most major and most modifiable and allow us to focus our efforts appropriately. Just a quick primer here. Inspections are done in the U.S. against primarily the U.S. Model Food Code document, which is a uniform set of provisions that address the safety and protection of food that's offered for sale. It's a model document that safeguards public health and ensures that food is not adulterated. It is a guidance document from the FDA that evaluates both foodborne illness risk factors as well as good retail practices. The challenge is that it's adopted by various local and state health departments in a variety of ways, with some requirements varying a bit among jurisdictions, and the frequency of inspection and the scoring can vary as well. But certainly the focus of these inspections needs to be on those factors that contribute most to foodborne illness, such as the data that CDC and FDA have shared with us. The challenge is there is not a consistent reporting format across the country. Certain jurisdictions are starting to post scores, either on websites or in some cases on the front of restaurants, which certainly can impact consumer trust. And here's data we have collected indicating the top 5 general categories of violations that are seen in health department inspections. Not surprisingly, they relate to some of the others we've seen. So the design of food and non-food contact surfaces, how clean they are, how they may be used and constructed. Things related to physical facilities, how they're installed, maintained, and cleaned. Food contact surfaces, the cleanliness of those. Also non-food contact surfaces. And issues relating to hand washing sinks being properly supplied and accessible. Here's a more granular set of data that shows the same things. Things related to physical facilities and their cleanliness, the cleanliness of food and non-food contact surfaces, the cleanliness of those and sanitizing of those surfaces, and the others as shown. So lots and lots of data are available, but we need to understand the risks that may be presented. So I believe that changing food safety behaviors of individuals really does require this total system approach, which includes certification and education, inspections and audits to verify that practices are being followed, training, and certainly motivation and encouragement goes a long way. We have seen that when service and training are focused and procedures are provided, we can have an impact. For example, having a certified manager on site reduced violations by about 24%. Doing things like completing daily food safety logs reduced violations by about 44%. And those restaurants that submitted corrective actions and had a follow-through plan averaged 22% less findings. So we need to analyze the data to identify trends, which might tell us which locations or regions to focus on and what type of solution might have the biggest effect. we need to recognize and ask for help. How can your vendors help you? Do they have solutions or tools that they can provide or could develop for you? Should you reach out to a training provider or someone who can help you develop training? And then certainly we need to be constantly looking for ways to verify that these solutions are effective by continuing to analyze the data. So I think it's interesting to kind of connect the dots here. In the left-hand part of this slide are shown the top contributing factors to foodborne illness from the CDC, including things like poor personal hygiene and contamination of equipment. Now, from the health department inspection data, we saw, again, top reasons why restaurants fail inspections that mirror these quite closely. The cleanliness and design of food and non-food contact surfaces, how well these may be sanitized, and adequate hand-washing sinks being supplied. But how does this translate down into real life? This is, I think, intuitively makes a lot of sense, but I now would like to walk you through a few different examples of where we've seen issues and real-life outbreaks of and consequences if these practices haven't been followed. And then I'd like to suggest some ways that we could learn from these outbreaks to move forward. So thinking first about one of these top areas of concern, the contamination of equipment and food contact surfaces, also how well they may be cleaned and sanitized. So this includes practices such as understanding how food flows through an establishment where there's a possibility of cross-contamination, and then making sure that the right barriers or procedures are set up to prevent pathogen transfer and its growth. Obviously using proper sanitization procedures and chemicals, following the label instructions, and then pest control as well. Several years ago, an outbreak happened where lettuce was contaminated with raw chicken juice. In this particular event, 14 different people became ill, and there were 2 hospitalizations. And they isolated Campylobacter jejuni from many of the patients. When health department inspectors went in to investigate this outbreak, they found multiple sources of contamination, including things like the countertop just being too small to adequately separate the raw poultry from other foods like lettuce. There were practices that were not being followed, such as the cook cut up raw chicken before preparing salads. This was shredded with a knife, and the cook wore a towel that she frequently used to dry her hands. And then there was uncertainty as to whether the cook had cleaned that countertop effectively after cutting up the chicken. Certainly, in retrospect, we see why an outbreak like this would be pretty easy to happen. But how could it have been prevented? Well, thinking about what offerings might have been able to be given by a coach or a provider or your own internal trainings. Thinking about hand care programs, cleaning and sanitation products, equipment and services. Perhaps thinking about the source of supply of the chicken in this case, and thinking about what antimicrobial treatments could have been used at the processing facility. Maybe color coding of equipment for raw and processed foods, pest elimination, and hand care compliance. All of these can go far at preventing contamination, which again, we know is one of those significant contributing factors to foodborne illness, but also one of those top identified health department inspection violations. So we need to work to prevent both of those from happening, outbreaks as well as violations, to prevent public health issues. Let's move to a second example related to poor personal hygiene and adequate hand washing. Certainly this includes things like being sanitary in habit, having people maintain and monitor their health, reporting illnesses and wounds, and then following basic hygiene practices, including good hand washing and proper glove use. Now, the Food Code has several references to this kind of information and can be a good source of guidance on what needs to be done, such as things related to the number of hand wash sinks, vending machines, where the sinks should be located, making sure that sink is accessible, providing the right supplies for that sink, and then certainly care and maintenance of those hand wash sinks. But sometimes people don't always follow the right things. And here's our second outbreak, where in this case, guests at several different events received sandwiches which were produced from a common source. It's estimated across these different events about 100 people or more were affected. And illness seemed to be associated with sandwiches that contained lettuce. Investigation revealed that an employee who had norovirus symptoms returned to work the same day his symptoms had ended, and he was still excreting norovirus in his stool. Probably the icing on the cake, so to speak, was the fact that the food prep sink was also used to wash lettuce as well as hams. So certainly we need to recognize that food handlers can contaminate food and cause consumers to be ill. So how would we use this to leverage these kinds of data to drive actions? Certainly through practices such as on-site review and coaching, suggesting various products and solutions that can influence behavior makes a lot of sense. But drilling this down, we know that one of the top violations from health department inspections is that hand washing sinks aren't always properly supplied and accessible. So ways to address this could be looking at staff behaviors, telling people when to wash, for example, making sure that sinks are not blocked, washing before glove use. Also tools and products, such as having towels available, having soap available, and signage available that all could influence these behaviors. And lastly, thinking about improper holding temperatures, which can be tied to foodborne illness. Certainly we know that these can allow pathogens to persist and in some cases increase to levels which may be harmful. So using proper hot and cold holding are crucial to food safety, and really this means keeping food out of the danger zone, which is generally considered to be below 41 degrees Fahrenheit and above 135. But we need to monitor to make sure that these temperatures are being controlled and using equipment that's designed right that will keep our food at the right temperature. Because without this, we know that foodborne illness intoxications can result. And this is illness attributed to agents such as Clostridium perfringens, Bacillus cereus, and Staph aureus, which accounts for about 1.3 million illnesses each year, or about 14% of those attributed to known cause. And I said before that these represent the number 3 cause of illness in the U.S. We need to recognize that spores from these kinds of agents are frequent contaminants in food, and that cooking will activate the spores to allow them to grow rapidly. And frankly, once these cells become activated, they grow much more quickly than other kinds of bacteria. They can grow in food with poor temperature control. So things like inadequate cooling or cold holding are key risk factors. So looking at an outbreak, a fact of these that's kind of interesting is that typically large numbers of people are affected because this is generally large volumes of food which are produced. So underreporting is pretty large. So even though we know about millions of these illnesses that occur, there likely are many, many more that aren't reported. Now, to look at this, between 1998 and 2008, CDC did a study looking at improper cooling practices, which contributed to over 500 outbreaks in food service settings. And they may have found things like, as is indicated in this pasta salad outbreak, which was prepared on Friday for a Saturday picnic. Following that picnic, leftovers were refrigerated, but the temperature in that refrigerator was as high as 57 degrees, and then were consumed on Monday night. And it's people who consumed that latter portion of the salad who got sick, and one person died, unfortunately. They were able to find high levels of Bacillus cereus toxin in the salad, most likely formed when that salad was stored for extended times at too hot of a temperature. So what did the data tell us? Well, when we've looked at data collection, in this case at over 420 restaurants and among 596 foods, the sample set included about 2/3 chain restaurants and about 1/3 independent restaurants, mostly serving a typical American kind of menu. recognized many different cooling methods that were used, including the refrigerator, ice bath, but also room temperature, ice wands, and then blast chillers. But they found that 16% of those ambient temperatures in the cooling units were greater than 41 degrees, and reach-in coolers being the worst. Other observations they recorded included the depths of food not being shallow enough, limited ventilation, stacking foods on top of each other, and no ice in the ice bath. And then from a training perspective, many of the managers reported that they were trained, yet they didn't monitor the temperature a good portion of the time. And there were issues with thermometer calibration as much as a third of the time. So certainly evidence of where practices might have been problematic and where focus needs to be emphasized. So thinking about how we could address this, certainly recognizing that the problem exists, both from the data on contributing factors from the CDC as well as the health department inspection data. Recognizing that it exists is one part, but then making sure you have the right interventions in place to target these appropriately. And this can include equipment interventions, thinking about maintenance of those, that the gaskets are in good shape, that the thermostat might be set at too high of a temperature. And then thinking about behaviors, containers being filled too high, improper pre-chilling, the importance of monitoring and verifying that these practices are in place. And then use of cooling devices can also help mitigate these risks. So to wrap up here, I think it's very important to think about what we can all do to prevent another outbreak from being attributed to one of these contributing factors. So thinking about how data can be leveraged, perhaps from inspections, from industry, which can be directed towards R&D development for new chemical products or equipment. Also insights on where to focus training and coaching, and thinking about broad service solutions such as ways to evaluate data and verify that practices are in place. Ideally, we want to tie this to foodborne illness decreases and with an overall goal to move from information to action. And I would be happy to address questions. We have a fair bit of time here, so please do go ahead and type your questions into the Q&A bars, and we would be happy to address those.
Yes, well, thank you, Ruth. That was really very instructive. I have had one little Q&A conversation going on here regarding hot holding temperatures, because there is a lot of confusion because food code says 135, and a lot of health departments are still using 140. Ruth, would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, this is one of those situations where we're seeing some differences, slight differences really, between the guidance from FDA and how health departments choose to implement that. There has been a change in the U.S. model food code at the national level, reducing this to 135 in the past few years. It comes down to a matter of adoption of particular parts or perhaps even the whole food code being done differently across the country. Some places still choose to use an older version of the food code related to 141 and may not have implemented the 135. There is some evidence, and that's why the food code was changed, that 135 could be a safer temperature in extreme situations. So in general, I think the guidance from the food code is a reasonable way to go from a purely scientific and technical standpoint. However, if the local or state health department requirements vary, it's important to follow those, as there was pretty good scientific justification why that's safe as well. And the differences between 135 and 141 were pretty slight. So the risk is not huge, but from a purely technical standpoint, it's probably something that should be adopted over time, but we need to wait till states get to that point.
And I'll mention that with the different restaurant chains and hospitality chains that EcoSure works with, many of them do have 140 set as their corporate standard just because there are so many regulatory agencies that they're working with. So do follow your corporate standards, as well as it's good to understand what your local jurisdiction is telling you as well. In terms of the reality of the inconsistencies with health department approaches, there is a question here about how does a large chain understand about pulling all that information together for greater consistency in guiding their chains?
Well, I think it's important that there be a way in place to have access to the data that's collected. If you think about a particular chain restaurant who may have hundreds or thousands of locations across the country, it's important that there be a way to look at those and to pull the data from all those together. So best would be a system approach, looking at the data very consistently through a particular system, and might aggregate the data to allow one to see where some differences might emerge, where there might be some problem restaurant locations that emerge, perhaps particular regions of the country, et cetera, in order to allow folks to be able to focus in on those locations that might need the most attention. But I also think it's a bit of a plea, and back to kind of the earlier question, to make inspections more consistent, certainly from a criteria standpoint, so that everybody's looking at practices from the same playing field, so to speak, and then also scoring them appropriately, such that a violation in one particular jurisdiction would be viewed very similarly in a different jurisdiction. We don't have that consistency today universally, and I think there are opportunities, and it would be very helpful, especially to folks who have locations in multiple jurisdictions, if there could be more consistency in the criteria, but also in the practices of inspection.
Thank you. There's also a question which I know is in your area of expertise about disinfecting for norovirus. So if you can let them know what's recommended for sanitizing, for disinfecting those surfaces.
Yep. It's important to recognize that in order to properly disinfect a surface against norovirus, you need to be using a product that has a claim or information essentially saying that this product is effective against norovirus. EPA requires that disinfecting products being used against norovirus have this information on the label. So it's very important to be using a product that has this claim on the label. And the way EPA has required that companies who are selling such disinfectants register their products is that they demonstrate effectiveness against an organism called feline calicivirus, which is a surrogate for norovirus that we can handle in a laboratory setting. Norovirus in and of itself is not conducive to typical laboratory handling, so we have to use a surrogate organism. So you want to look for a product that has a claim against an organism called feline calicivirus, which serves as a surrogate for norovirus.
Thank you. Another question is, there's a new trend coming to the area, which is catch and cook. I'm assuming they're talking about fish. How does a restaurant mitigate the risks involved when a customer brings in their own catch?
Oh, goodness. That's not a trend that I have heard of, but it sounds interesting. One of the risks with seafood is improper storage from a temperature standpoint. And if seafood is not refrigerated promptly after catching, the native bacteria that are found in seafood, just as a matter of normal flora that's there, can grow with temperature abuse and produce toxins that can make people sick. This is things like histamine production and so on. So without good assurance that that seafood had been effectively stored cold prior to its being cooked, and the cooking does not remove the effects of those toxins, I would be very cautious about treating those kinds of products or serving those kinds of products unless I knew that I had good control and could verify that temperature control had been very well taken care of throughout the process. And this could include, what's done within the restaurant, but also looking to what happens to that seafood before it enters the restaurant. So what the supplier may have done, what the catching, the boats and so on that are catching the fish have done. Verifying that those practices are in place and are being followed is very important as well.
Very good. And then there's a question in terms of how are undercooked foods addressed on the U.S. Food Code? That might be related to a consumer advisory, perhaps?
Yeah. Well, it is required in most jurisdictions, and it's certainly suggested in the Food Code guidance that there be these sorts of warnings placed on menus or in the restaurant itself, warning people of the risks of undercooked ground beef, for example, or undercooked seafood to essentially give people a public health warning that there can be concerns with these sorts of products. The Food Code does provide guidance around how foods that can be contaminated, raw foods, need to be cooked to mitigate those risks. And this includes, various cook temperatures that certain products need to be cooked to. And if that's not done, there is a higher risk of foodborne illness as a result. Would you like to add anything to that, Miriam?
No, I think that it's, yes, I think that it is important to understand that the consumer advisory, first off, does not mitigate any liability. It does give information to the consumer, but if you're serving foods that are either raw or undercooked, that there is a risk there, so it is important to understand that. And also just a little addition to that for those who aren't familiar, with children's menus, if you serve hamburgers, those now must be cooked to 155. Those are not covered any longer by the consumer advisory warning. So if you do actually have a children's menu and have any ground meats that are served, those all must be cooked to 155, in case people weren't aware of that. That was a more recent change to the Food Code. We have another question here about risk around soda fountain drink machines and nozzles and ice machines. What kind of illnesses or risk would be there? And then a follow-up question was about how often should these be checked and deep cleaned, and are there outbreaks associated with beverage machines and ice?
Certainly there can be risks with these kinds of equipment, but we need to look at the kinds of products, especially first addressing the idea of soda machines and the potential risks that those products may cause. Typical soda or soft drink types of products have a very, very low pH, which will not allow typical pathogenic organisms like salmonella, for example, to survive. They just will be killed at the low pHs of these kinds of products. That's not to say there can't be risks, because there are other kinds of organisms like yeast and mold which are able to grow at these lower pH values and can certainly lead to quality issues with the typical soft drink or soda type products. Now, ice can be a different story, although because ice is so cold, it's not going to permit the growth of organisms. So if a contaminant were there, it's not likely to increase in the ice itself. But it's also not going to be killed. It essentially will survive in this cold state. So we need to be aware of things like the source of the water that's used to make the ice, how it might have been handled prior to being received at a food service establishment if someone is buying ice that's made elsewhere. Watching for things like human handling that might have occurred in the packaging process, for example. But then also just general cleanliness of an ice machine is very important as well. There can be organisms that can grow and be maintained in these sorts of machines as well, and they need to be addressed carefully. As far as numbers of outbreaks attributed to these kinds of products, the evidence is not all that significant. We have not seen a lot, really any outbreaks attributed to consumption of these kinds of products. There's been some suggestion of things, a different public health organism called Legionella that can potentially be a risk in things like ice machines. It's not a foodborne pathogen, but actually infects people through an inhalation route. And there's some suggestion there could be issues with poorly cleaned ice machines contributing to those sorts of outbreaks. But frankly, the evidence on that is still emerging as well. But regardless, these systems need to be cleaned and sanitized effectively following recommendations of the manufacturers. And in order for sanitizing to work effectively, the machines need to be cleaned. That is, removing food residues, removing residues of any slime or those sorts of things that might be in existence in an ice machine, for example, in order for the sanitizer to work, which will go in and then kill any organisms that might be remaining. And this would include yeasts and mold in a soft drink machine and any other kinds of organisms in an ice machine.
And I think it's also important to note, just from a quality perspective, that you don't want your guests to have drinks that have off flavors and off odors. If you've ever had a glass of ice water that has that musty, moldy smell, that's generally associated with poor cleaning practices of the ice-making machine or the ice bins. So you want to keep that in mind, that you don't want to have an off-putting situation with your guests. There have also been a couple questions here regarding different situations with traditional ethnic foods, such as sushi rice, and other items that may not be cooked in the traditional United States Food Code types of ways, and about the risks there and what people need to consider.
Yeah, I think we need to think about what the potential risks are that are presented by those ingredients. And seafood, being a raw animal commodity, can be contaminated with pathogens and other spoilage-type organisms. So it can be a vehicle for foodborne illness, and the risk is higher in consumption of these kinds of foods. That said, there are practices that are in place, such as freezing of seafood before it's made into sushi, to mitigate hazards that might be there from parasites, as an example. But again, that freezing process needs to be very, very well controlled to ensure that it's effectively addressing the hazard of concern. And then certainly making sure that in addition to the risk posed by the raw fish itself, that there not be added risks from the person who's preparing the sushi. That is, personal hygiene must be absolutely supreme, as well as the cleanliness of the surfaces on which that sushi might be produced, to prevent any issues from cross-contamination from other kinds of foods in that particular location. So the risk is not zero on anything, really, but we need to recognize that the risks from these kinds of products is higher than what it would be if that raw product had been cooked.
And there was also a mention of the sticky rice that is part of the sushi rolls, which is traditionally held at room temperature, and about how inspectors deal with that, and in terms of either HACCP plans or variances.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's related to that time temperature control. And we know that if foods, especially things like rice, are held at temperatures where growth can occur, which is generally thought to be ambient temperatures or above 41 degrees, there can be issues. So another way to control that is to limit the amount of time that food, that is the rice, could be stored at those temperatures. So having very strict monitoring of when that rice, for example, was placed at that room temperature setting, and then how long it has sat at that temperature, and then when it's removed from service, is crucial to control the possible risk from toxins being produced in those kinds of products.
Right, and as long as, and if they're doing the acidification of the sticky rice, that they are also properly monitoring that and keeping those records. That a health inspector will want to see those records along with the HACCP plan that accompanies the sticky rice.
Yeah, it's a matter of... Yeah. I was going to say, sorry, that it's a matter of essentially changing the environment in which that pathogen might be able to survive. So using acid to change that typical environment of rice can be an effective tool as well, but needs to be monitored.
Correct. There was also kind of a follow-up question about the catch and cook question about can you have a guest sign a waiver if they bring their own fish in to get cooked? And if you don't mind, Ruth, I'll jump in on
yes,
this.
Yes, please.
We have had Bill Marler speak on a few of our webinars, and he handles many different food illness-related cases. And I had once asked him a question about, if you have a consumer advisory on a menu, does that limit your liability or does that negate your liability if someone happens to get sick? And the fact is, if someone becomes ill in your facility, even with warnings and even with waivers, those are not ironclad, and you are still going to be liable, and there still can be litigation, and there's always costs that accompanies those. So it is a matter of the risk that you want to take when you allow catch and cook facilities. And I know that around fishing areas, sometimes that's a common practice for local restaurants. But there's still going to be risk involved with you taking on that responsibility. Let's see, we have a question here about concern about ice buildup in ice cream freezers. And I'm assuming they were talking about some of the different, the type of freezers where the ice cream vats are not covered.
Okay. Well, certainly that can be the source of quality issues. And as I said before, we're not going to see growth of organisms in the ice itself because it's simply below the limit where bacteria typically are able to grow. But we'd certainly want to be concerned about it from a potential sanitation perspective and how it might affect the quality of that ice cream, and as well as the operation of that equipment. Following the manufacturer's instructions to make sure that that equipment is performing optimally is important to both prolong the life of the equipment and make sure it's operating most effectively, but also to make sure that the product, that is the ice cream that's coming out of that freezer, is of the highest quality as it can possibly be.
Thank you. And there's a few questions here that are related, going back to sushi, or either fish that's going to be undercooked or served raw or raw marinated. As when is it mandatory to freeze fish? Well, I would have to look at specific jurisdictions to get the very, very specifics on this. So I certainly would urge consideration of that kind of information and looking for that as a reference. But generally, if fish is frozen for an extended time at cold temperatures, and I'm talking, below 10 degrees Fahrenheit and perhaps below 0 degrees Fahrenheit, we know there can be death of any parasite organisms that could be contaminating that fish flesh. So bottom line, it's a matter of finding the right source of information, and I don't have that off the top of my head. Miriam, would you perhaps have a source, or is that something we could get back to them with? Well, the food code is very specific in terms of it's also a time temperature issue. Either it's a colder temperature at which the fish is frozen for a shorter period of time, or longer at a slightly higher temperature. But the whole issue is that if you are obtaining fish to serve, raw or undercooked, with the exception of some tuna and salmon, and it also does go into more conversation in terms of farm-raised items and what the farm-raised fish might be given as feed. So it's actually kind of a longer answer than we can probably give you here. But the basic thing is to check your local food code. What species are you serving? And if it is one that does require freezing, if you're having your vendor provide you with the parasite destruction, then there should be an accompanying letter or tags with that product to verify that. But this does vary widely, and you should double-check with local health departments. I know that just recently the state of Hawaii updated their food code. They previously did not require parasite destruction information, where now they do. So do check your local food codes for more of the specifics, and then check with your vendors in terms of the different issues that are brought up in terms of how things are frozen, if they're wild or farm raised, and also what the feed is for those that are farm raised. Let's see. We still have more questions that are coming in here. Are there any issues about making fermented foods at room temperature, such as pickles?
Well, again, you would want to make sure that any risks that are there are mitigated, and how quickly the acidification would occur. If we think just pickles and cucumbers, we know that cucumbers, being a vegetable product that's grown outside, contaminated with soil, just as part of its normal growing practice, it can be contaminated with bacteria from that soil. So they need to be carefully washed to remove any potential source of bacteria such as that, and then acidified quickly. So it's a matter of controlling that fermentation process to prevent any organisms that might remain on those cucumbers to be growing before the lower pH conditions are achieved.
Thank you. And here's a question that I think has had a lot of conversation out there lately. It's about any suggestions on helping food establishments to get their employees to report their illnesses or to get them not to work when they're ill. I know that there's issues about health care and reporting in, and many issues that go around that, along with the lost wages. We could probably do a whole hour on that. But Ruth, what comments do you have that you can share with the group?
Well, it's quite easy for me to sit in an office here and to say that people absolutely should not be working when they're sick, and that from a purely scientific and technical standpoint is true. We know that norovirus is the #1 cause of foodborne illness and causes billions of dollars each year in healthcare costs, as I showed in the webinar. The reality of implementing such a program is challenging for many of the reasons that we also reviewed. But good faith efforts need to be made because the public health risks from something like norovirus are so high. Even things like salmonella can be transmitted by ill employees, and there have been outbreaks from that. And we saw that the dollar cost and health costs from something like salmonella are extremely significant. So we need to be doing all that we can, and I think educating people on what the true costs and risks of foodborne illness are is really important. And that includes our regulators, perhaps, or state legislatures, for example, who might have the power to implement things like paid sick leave or mandatory sick leave, and coming up with ways as best we can to implement that. But I certainly understand there's a ton of challenges in doing that. But there may be ways to work around this, and I know of some chain restaurants, for example, who do their best to not penalize people for taking sick time, but are very liberal about offering alternate shifts so that people don't suffer from significant lost wages. And having practices like that in place encourage appropriate use of sick time and really go further to protecting public health. Because bottom line, it truly is an issue that can affect a lot of people, much more so than just the food handler, him or herself, because they're serving so many others and can certainly have an impact on those folks as well.
Just kind of an aside on that topic, the FDA has a wonderful series of oral culture learning materials that work with a lot of storyboards, and I think being able to use those types of things to really help educate the back-of-house worker in a very easy-to-understand manner is also something that can be used. The fact is that a lot of times people don't understand, okay, with norovirus, it is a very a short illness typically. So, you were sick last night, today you feel better. But understanding that hand washing continues to be crucial because you still will shed cells in your feces after you've had norovirus. So even using additional training tools such as oral history information, and those are available in many different languages at the FDA website. If you just search for oral training materials, that can also be helpful. And so yes, it's a governmental issue, it's a financial issue, it's a training issue, and so many of those things are important to continue to think about. But I think when you're on site, from at least my perspective, it's very important to continue the training and continue the conversation so that people do understand the risk that they're putting their employees to. Now, we haven't been able to get to all of our questions, but I see we're at the top of the hour, but there were great questions and great conversation. So, Dr. Petran, I'd like to thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Great questions, and I think we need to think about the information we've talked about here and how to leverage that to improve food safety.
Well, thank you very much. And I'd like to remind all of you that next month we will be having our next webinar. And if the WebEx admin can help me, I'm having trouble advancing my slides here. I'm having some lag time. We'll be having the next webinar the third Tuesday of February. And our guest speaker is going to be Dr. Benjamin Chapman from North Carolina State. And he's going to be talking about hand washing and the issues around that. And Ruth, if you can see the exact title, can you share that with us?
It's part of our series for Keeping It Clean in 2015, which is our theme for the year. And Ben's title is Hand Washing Woes: The Science, the Barriers, and Strategies for Behavior Change. I think it'll be a pretty good presentation, as he has done a lot of analysis of really what drives behaviors. So it'll address, frankly, some of the questions we talked about today.
Thank you very much with that. And then also I'll remind you that at the end of the webinar today, please take the survey. That is where you request your continuing education certificates. And we're also looking for more ideas for future webinars. So your feedback is always very important to us, and we really appreciate you taking time out of your busy day to listen to us. And there will also be a rebroadcast available. If you go to the Ecolab website and look for the keyword webinar, that you can watch any of our webinars at any time, and then you would contact me, Miriam Eisenberg, at ecolab.com, and ask for continuing education certificates after you view those as well. So again, thank you for joining us today, and we look forward to meeting with you next month.